There's definitely an invisible hand that is trying to control the human population, lower the human population, tell us that we're all evil for wanting to eat meat, have children, drive cars, enjoy vacations. And the person at the center of most of that, once you research, is none other than Bill Gates. To help me understand this, I have with me from the United Kingdom, Daniel Jupp. Daniel, thank you so much for joining me.
It's a pleasure and an honor to talk to you, Stephen.
So, one of the first questions that I have is, in your opinion, why do you think Bill Gates should be considered one of the most dangerous men alive today?
Well, the reality we face is that there are a number of extremely powerful people at the moment, billionaires, who are engaging in politics very actively and shaping the world to their desires. And the reason I think that Bill Gates is the most dangerous of these, we're all aware of people like George Soros as well. But the reason I think that Bill Gates is the most dangerous is because he's built up the largest network of influence, largely through the Gates Foundation, which is the world's biggest charitable foundation. So he surpassed the Open Society Foundation of George Soros, and he's surpassed the Rockefeller Foundation as well. This is it's given away more than $50 billion. But it's strangely managed to retain its wealth whilst doing so. And Bill Gates has managed to retain his wealth. And one of the interesting features about it is that his influence is so great that he actually organizes and instructs other billionaires. So it was Bill Gates who was primarily behind the so-called Giving Pledge. And that united about 20 years ago people like Warren Buffett behind the aims and policies that Bill Gates was saying were the most important ones to follow. So his influence is vast, and he's got a private wealth still, which makes him the fourth richest man in the world. But the real problem is not so much the private wealth, but the influence of the foundation, because the foundation is the second biggest funder of the World Health Organization. And we're approaching now, we've had going on for quite a while now, movements towards a new international pandemic treaty that would effectively see the World Health Organization take charge in the case of any future pandemics. And they would be the ones declaring what was a pandemic. Now, we all saw the terrible, disastrous measures that were taken during COVID. Bill Gates was the single individual most responsible for those measures through his influence via the Gates Foundation and via the World Health Organization. He supplies 11 to 13% of their funding every year, which is bigger than multiple nations combined. And really, he was the brainchild who came up with the idea of Gavi, which is the big organization pushing for vaccination globally and acting as a kind of sounding board for pharmaceutical companies who are developing vaccines. And Bill Gates was instrumental in the foundation of Gavi as well. Now, the current head of the World Health Organization, the guy who was also in charge during COVID, is Dr. Tedros. And Dr. Tedros was a former employee of Gavi, which, he interacted very heavily with Bill Gates. And you could pretty much say that Bill Gates handpicked him to head the World Health Organization. So the level of influence that he has is enormous. And it's, all non-democratic. It's all non-accountable, because we're talking about institutions and organizations with no elected members. They're people who are selected to be in place, and Bill Gates is more than any other individual selecting those people.
Wow. Okay. What makes me crazy about this billionaire class that wants to control the population is, I don't know if you follow American news, but just this last week, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook was called in to testify before Congress under oath about how Facebook has been one of the largest contributors of trafficking of children, of women, causing people to unalive themselves. Just being cautious the words that I say here because YouTube will trigger this video. But so he goes there, and Senator Hawley and Cruz say to him, you know, you've never even apologized to all these families that have lost their teenagers. Do you ever plan to do that? Well, he stands up and he apologizes right there. I'm so sorry. You know, we've done our best. We've done our best, right? So most people saw that news cycle. What they didn't see is in the next 2 days, his net worth increased by $28 billion.
Yeah.
It's a cabal. It's a cabal of people that are all coming together to make each other more rich, more powerful, more influential, and they do not have humanity and the good of humanity at the center of their focus. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you're absolutely right there. And, you know, we know that, for example, I do have a great interest in US politics. We know, for example, that Zuckerberg supplied hundreds of millions of dollars to enable Democrat cities to field armies of operatives who were effectively stealing the 2020 election. And, you know, Zuckerberg was right behind that. His influence and the terrible influence of George Soros on the US justice system is obvious. And obvious to anyone who's being impartial and fair about these things, because you know, mainstream media is purchased and controlled, and these billionaires supply most of its money and funding now. So they control what it says. You know, so all of them are acting in a malign way, really. There's very few that we can point to and say, well, they're just enjoying their wealth, or they're honestly putting their wealth into politics in ways that we can see and understand and that are democratic and accountable. So, for example, if you want to stand for election, as Ross Perot did, or as Donald Trump does, everyone knows what your agenda is and where you're coming from. And, you know, you're putting your money forward honestly in that sense. But when you use your money to subvert control of institutions, which is what most of these people do, you're not being honest about the way you're driving the agenda of global politics. And that's what we saw with COVID. Now, you know, it's not coincidental that during the COVID period, we saw the greatest transfer of wealth we've ever witnessed. Trillions of dollars went from ordinary people's pockets who were suffering, you know, under lockdowns and who were not allowed to work, who were restricted at home. All that money that was spent on measures that were unnecessary, on lockdowns and on a degree of purchasing of medical goods that wasn't necessary, that money was going into the people who were investing in pharmaceutical companies, investing in vaccine development, you know, and Bill Gates was one of the principal figures of that. You know, his wealth increased by about 30% during the 2 main years of COVID. And this was standard for all of the leading billionaires. They were all investing in pharmaceutical companies and they were all profiting massively from it. And they were directing governments through influence on the World Health Organization and through the example of the Gates Foundation. So they were saying, look, there's this pandemic, government needs to respond to it very quickly. It's very dangerous. Millions of people are going to die. Well, who was telling us that millions of people were going to die? The people telling us that information came from Imperial College London. And the team at Imperial College London, led by Professor Ferguson, their computer modeling of projections of how many people would die from the pandemic were funded by Bill Gates. Gates has previously funded the Imperial College team. So they purchased the science, they purchased the media, and then they told us, they whipped up hysteria, and they told us all that we needed to spend all this money on pharmaceutical companies, and that governments had to spend all this money as well. And in some cases, they were the people who were actually behind what seems likely the lab development of the vaccine of the virus in the first place. The same people were funding gain of function research. Dr. Fauci, I'm sure most of your listeners and viewers will know him. He was intimately involved in gain of function research, and his organization, which is supposed to be a public body, was funding this gain of function research in Wuhan. Well, again, you look at those people, you look at the actors involved, and nearly all of them have received funding at some stage from the Gates Foundation, or they've done joint initiatives together. And lo and behold, all the people that funded all this were then the people who were told, well, you're the only experts we can use to solve it. So they created a crisis. They were then designated to solve the crisis, and they made huge amounts of money from it.
Oh my gosh. It's like, they say hindsight is 2020. It's like so easy to see how this whole thing was a setup. Now we know that the virus was real. We're not saying that, right?
Yeah.
One thing I did want to correct you on, and this is maybe just your British accent, but it's actually pronounced Dr. Fraudchi. The R and the D are silent. Dr. Fraudchi.
Yes.
No, I mean, it's crazy, right? And maybe you can confirm this for my audience, but I read that right before the pandemic, Bill Gates gave mainstream media companies $300 million to make sure that people weren't speaking evil of him on the mainstream media. Now, he didn't say that directly. He said, this is to keep journalism alive, right? But you don't bite the hand that feeds you. CNN gets like 80% of their income from big pharma. They're never going to bite the hand that feeds them. Now they get this huge influx of cash before the pandemic. They're never going to bite the hand. Had you heard anything like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Bill Gates funds mainstream media enormously, and the problem for mainstream media is they need the funding because their audience is dying and it's going to alternative media everywhere. If you just compare, for example, the audiences Tucker Carlson had when he was on Fox compared to the audiences he can garner as an independent. When people know that his voice is genuinely independent and not controlled by anyone. And the explosion of alternative media and what we're doing now has really put mainstream media under pressure. So they need that money because their audience is dying. But it's a vicious circle for them, because the more they're indebted to people like Bill Gates, the more obviously they are lying in their coverage of events, because they won't say anything negative about the vaccines. They took ages to say anything negative whatsoever about them. They won't really honestly look at things like the consequences we've seen, which is from COVID onwards, we've seen, in many places, particularly the places that had the highest take up of vaccine use, we've seen a 20% increase on average in excess deaths. Now, we're told, and the fact checkers will tell you immediately, who are also paid for organisations who are essentially obeying orders, but fact checkers will tell you there's no direct link between rises in excess deaths and the introduction of the vaccines. But there's a strong correlation there. And this is what we see all the time. We see correlation of harmful effects with the policies and programs that people like Bill Gates have pushed. And then we're told that the harmful effects are from some other cause, or we should ignore them altogether. But literally, they're refusing to fund the research that would confirm that it's causation rather than correlation, because they don't want that answer. So, you've got people, it's very easy for us to do an independent dialogue. It's much more difficult for, say, a science team to be able to independently analyze the data, although there's people on Substack doing very good work along those lines.
Yeah, I love the independent journalism. I was just looking up on my phone. People can search this for themselves. The Nestle food company has reportedly caused over 212,000 infant deaths because they tried to convince mothers in third world countries that the science of formula was better than natural breast milk. Now, they went back and they figured out what really happened is that they poisoned about 10 million children because they were putting their formula into bad water instead of being through a mother's body, right? 212,000 died because of the Nestle Corporation, 10 million poisoned that didn't die. People can look this up for themselves. I bring that up because Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation have been accused of hundreds of thousands of damaged children all over the world, but you can't find it because Google and Yahoo, Bing, all of those, they cover these articles for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. But have you seen these? Have you read these? I have.
I wasn't aware of the Nestle one, but there are examples, directly in connection with Bill Gates. For example, it's cited in Robert F. Kennedy's book on Fauci. The polio vaccine development in India, and what effectively happened there is that Bill Gates took over large parts of the duties of the Indian state. So he did what he always does. He ingratiated himself with Indian leaders. He took over health functions of the Indian state, and they introduced a polio eradication program. And that sort of ran mainly between 2000 and 2017. In that period, according to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., there was between 490,000 and 500,000 cases of non-polio acute flaccid paralysis, which is a condition twice as dangerous as polio itself. So Bill Gates and his supporters go away and say, we eradicated polio from India, and this is a wonderful thing, and we've done, achieved a marvelous event. What you're then told by fact checkers is that the emergence at the same time of a worse condition that's twice as dangerous, that may have killed up to 500,000 people, was purely coincidental. And they won't fund the research into looking as to whether it was caused by the vaccine. So there are two Indian studies that were pretty much suppressed that showed correlation. So you have the vaccines that are pushed by the Gates Foundation. Immediately after, you get this harmful effect, and it goes on throughout the vaccinations. When the polio vaccinations are reduced and cease, the cases of non-polio acute flaccid paralysis also decline. But we're supposed to consider, again, this is purely coincidental and not look into it whatsoever. And, anyone who does look into it is suppressed. And that's the problem here, because I don't know for a fact that these things are linked. But it seems likely to me that if every time you have one of these major vaccination campaigns, you have a series of harms that correlate with it, they might be caused by it. Yeah. But it's very, very difficult for people to get funding to research that, because all the bodies that would normally supply that funding are controlled by people profiting by pretending these harms don't exist.
Yeah, well, I'll give you two examples. You guys probably have this in the United Kingdom. We definitely had it here in the United States, but there was this new miracle product that came out in building called asbestos. And it was in
Yes.
everything. It was in ceilings. It was in the floors. It was in tiles. It was in everything. And they fought tooth and nail to say there's no correlation between a massive uptick in cancer and sickness and this new product. And they fought it and they fought it and they fought it until they couldn't hide it anymore. And then they went out of business. And then all of a sudden, boom, the government comes out and says, actually, this stuff is incredibly dangerous. You need hazmat suits in order to remove it. And now that stuff is still, it's still here in the United States. I watch these renovation shows with my wife, and they're like, oh my gosh, there's asbestos. We've got to get that out of here, right? And anyway, so like that's an example of a major correlation where they tried to say it wasn't one thing and then it was another. I forgot the other example. It'll come back to me here in a minute, but
well, asbestos is an interesting one, because I've actually worked in the asbestos industry briefly,
really?
and I've done asbestos tests. So, you know, I know exactly what measures you're supposed to take for safety when you're testing for asbestos. And they don't wear little plastic masks, you know, like the N95 masks. When you're testing for asbestos, you wear much bigger filter masks, you know, so they have a great big filter on the front, and you have to regularly change that. And you also wear like a hazmat suit, you know, and that's standard industry procedure. And everyone who's worked in asbestos knows that the masks that were forced on people during COVID and that Bill Gates supported have no effect whatsoever. They're, you know, and that's what the gold standard research that was done by the Cochrane Library after the event has since confirmed, that they have negligible or no effect. But you know, millions of tons of this plastic crap was pumped into the oceans as a result of lots of people being forced to wear them, and they have negative effects, for example, on childhood social development, because children were forced to wear these things. You know, they have health effects themselves that are negative. And Bill Gates was pushing for the wearing of masks throughout COVID, and will no doubt be pushing for the wearing of them again if there's another pandemic or if they declare another pandemic. And these things were utterly useless. So it's very difficult for ordinary people, or people who might know, for example, for working in asbestos, know that the size of the particles that you're dealing with wouldn't be prevented by a normal plastic mask whatsoever. And, you know, anybody with any knowledge of that area would know that. And, you know, it was on product specifications as well. Most of the masks that people ended up wearing or were forced to wear, you know, in places like Amazon, they were forcing their staff to wear them while they were, you know, while we were going through the pandemic. That they had no effect, and the science would say that they had no effect. The existing science said that they had no effect and were completely useless. But a lot of people made a lot of money from selling this stuff.
Yeah. You know, one example that will prove our point here, that people listening to this, this may be a little bit crude, but if you were wearing your mask, the normal one that most people were wearing, a bandana or just the normal, you know, facial mask that a surgeon would wear, if somebody farted next to you and you could smell it, then by golly, you know that little COVID virus was definitely getting through to your nose, because a fart particle is significantly bigger than a COVID particle. And so, boom, there you go, right? Oh, I remember the other example is Johnson & Johnson tried extremely hard to say that their talc baby powder was not giving women ovarian cancer. Well, after fighting it for almost a decade, guess what? It was giving hundreds of thousands of women ovarian cancer, including my mother-in-law, who died from that. And so anyway, my point is, you know, we can't live being suspicious of everything. But when you have somebody who is a part of creating the problem, profiting from the problem, controlling the narrative, and then quietly exiting. I mean, Bill Gates made over $500 million just on vaccine stocks alone. That is a proven fact, right? So anyway, we just have to be really careful where we're getting our information from.
Absolutely, because unfortunately, all of the mainstream media, they're reliant on their funding from these people, and they don't tell the truth on it. And it's only the growth of alternative media that has allowed people to get a certain extent of the truth. But we've had things like, in the UK, we've had a COVID inquiry that's been looking into it. And what that COVID inquiry should have been saying is that these measures were taken by unaccountable bodies. They effectively hijacked the global health policy of the entire planet, and they injected 70% of the human species with an experimental vaccine that used new techniques and new methods, wasn't really a vaccine at all by old definitions, and which has had known harmful effects. And there were known harmful effects in what little testing there was done. We know that. We've since seen some of the Pfizer documents, for example, that came out following freedom of information requests. So there's a whole litany of harmful effects, but they're still telling us that all of this stuff is safe and effective. At the height of it, they were pushing it on pregnant women when every animal study there had been showed that you do not supply mRNA to pregnant animals, let alone human beings. And I don't want to sound like I'm raising fears unnecessarily, but no long-term studies were done. There's no financial accountability possible because they were all protected under emergency measures. So we effectively took a huge experiment with the whole human race on the say-so of a very small number of people. And that's why I say that Bill Gates is the most dangerous of the billionaires, because George Soros can be very dangerous in releasing some terrible people onto your streets and backing political policies that make your streets more dangerous for you to live on. And we know how bad some of the prosecutors linked to George Soros are. But Bill Gates was the one who, more than anyone else, pushed a needle into billions of arms that didn't necessarily need to be there at all, and that can have harmful effects.
Yeah, well, in America, we know that God gave us two arms, one for the flu shot and one for the COVID shot. At least that's what our leaders were telling us over and over and over again. But okay, so
yeah, it was like a cult, wasn't it? It was at the height of it. It was exactly like a cult, and the mainstream media were all marshaled to brainwash people into this stuff. And we've all laughed at the accounts we've seen online of people who are kind of triple masked and alone on the ocean in a little boat, and they've got 3 masks on, and we've laughed at the things that some people did. And you had orchestras that were playing their instruments with a little hole cut in a mask over their faces. We had indoor outdoor restaurant bubbles where it was apparently too dangerous for people to gather indoors, but it was okay if you built a plastic extension for them to sit in outdoors, and restaurants did that. And we were told that if you followed little arrows on the ground, somehow the virus would be following those arrows as well and would obey the little arrows, and you couldn't be harmed. If you stood up in a restaurant, the virus could get you, but if you sat down and you were eating, it couldn't get you.
Yeah.
All of it was obviously and patently, by rational terms, insane, but it established huge levels of control that got people on board and that brainwashed people so effectively that they were prepared to accept any amount of consequence, any amount of negative consequence, because it was all for our safety.
Yeah. Oh, crazy. Okay, you've written the book Gates of Hell, great title. why Bill Gates is the most dangerous person in the world. As you researched that and wrote that, what was maybe the number one thing that stood out to you or caught you off guard about Bill Gates?
Um, I think it's the most dangerous thing is that he's got no sense of risk. And if you look at what he's doing and the influence he has on the world stage, it's very, very dangerous for someone to have that level of influence and to be directing global health policies and have no sense of risk. If you look at the model that was established for how Microsoft built up his fortune, it was release a product as quickly as possible, corner the market, and then worry about any faults or problems or bugs. That's why you have, Microsoft 2.0. That's why you have these ongoing, and it was a feature of computer science and computer design that you would release your improvements after the event. Well, that's all well and good with computer hardware or software. It's not very good when the thing you're dealing with is human beings and stuff that goes into their bodies and stuff that can kill them. So, there's no 2.0 Stephen Gardner and there's no 2.0 Daniel Jupp. If we are persuaded to take something that's dangerous for us and we then have a heart attack and die, then that's it. You can't reboot human beings. And the model that was practiced for developing computers and cornering market share, which was very, very successful for Microsoft, is the same model he follows in global health policy. And that's what's very, very dangerous. And, if you look at the net zero stuff as well, quite a lot of the book talks about the green measures that he backs, because it's not just vaccines. One of the things that distinguishes Bill Gates is that he doesn't concentrate on one area. So he's one of the biggest pushers of vaccines, but he's also one of the biggest pushers of net zero. And with net zero policies, again, what we're seeing is a huge experiment that can wreck in normal people's lives, a massive global experiment. But I say global experiment, but in that case, it seems to be that the Western world has to take up the whole burden of it, and ordinary people in the West. And, Bill Gates has very little conception of risk happening to them. And, for example, our lives decreasing in our access to energy, our access to heat, our access to food supplies, all affected by net zero policies that can damage those things.
Yeah.
So the biggest thing is there's not an organization above him that's holding him to account, and he has no conception of risk himself, because he's never experienced risk in the way that ordinary people have. He's never lived an ordinary life. He comes from a very, very wealthy and privileged background, as do many of these kind of very rich left-wing people. His father and his mother were both powerful and influential people in Seattle. He's only ever known wealth. When he established Microsoft, he had $1 million trust fund behind him. So if he failed, it didn't matter. But as I say, if you fail with public health policy, people die, and lots of people die. And that's the true danger of it.
Yeah. Wow. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on. I'm going to put a link to Gates of Hell down below so that people can go check that out. If people want to follow you online, what's the best way for them to do that?
Probably the best way is through my Substack. So I've got a Substack called Jupplandia. So if you go jupplandia.substack.com, that should get to me. I talk to people every day on that. I also have a Facebook presence, so you can find me under Daniel Jupp on Facebook. I'm a bit of a Luddite, so I'm a bit behind on all the other things. I'm not on Rumble or anything like that. So those are the two main areas where people can get hold of me.
Okay, I'll make sure to put those down below. Daniel Jupp, thank you so much for writing this book, coming on, telling us, warning us based on all the years of research that you've done on Bill Gates. Thank you so much. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.